It started with a quiet dinner, one that had no room for celebration, no trace of warmth, just the clink of forks and the hum of disappointment thick in the air. My name is Jonah, and the day my family cut me off, it wasn't stormy or dramatic. It was ordinary in the worst way, too quiet, too normal for what should have been a moment of truth. I'd come out that morning. After years of pretending, smiling through dinners I didn't enjoy, nodding along to jokes that stung, and avoiding every personal question, I finally told them I was gay. Not with a grand speech. Just a simple sentence, trying to steady my voice over coffee. My mom went silent first, her hand frozen midair with a spoon of cereal. My dad blinked once, then turned the page of his newspaper like I'd told him the weather forecast. My sister, Lacy, stared at me like I'd grown horns. And just like that, breakfast ended. They didn't scream. They didn't cry. They just moved on without me. The next day, the locks were changed. My key no longer worked. I stood on the front porch, duffel bag in hand, still trying to convince myself it was a mistake. Maybe it was a test. Maybe they just needed time. But as the sun dipped behind the roof, the truth settled on my shoulders like a second skin. They had erased me. No explanation. No warning. Just silence and a voicemail from my mother that said I'd forced their hand and broken trust. I didn't know what trust I'd broken by telling the truth. What kind of family teaches you to lie just to be loved? For the first 2 nights, I stayed with my friend Nate. His couch wasn't comfortable, but his silence was kind. He didn't ask questions. He just let me be. But I knew I couldn't stay there forever. Pride was a funny thing. I had barely enough of it left to not want to be someone's burden, but just enough to keep me from calling my family to beg. I found a part-time job at a bookstore downtown, the kind that smelled like old paper and brewed its own bitter coffee in the back. It paid poorly, but it gave me space to breathe. I rented a small room from a retired school teacher who never pried into my past. Life didn't get easier, but it kept going. I told myself I'd build something new, piece by piece. Months passed, then a year. I missed birthdays, holidays, the ordinary sound of my mother's humming when she cooked. I even missed the things I used to resent, the rules, the long lectures, the church pews on Sundays. I knew it wasn't those things I missed. It was the illusion of being wanted, of belonging somewhere. But illusions can be harder to kill than truths. Then one evening, as the bookstore was closing and the sky outside was turning that soft orange pink, I got a message from Adrian, my ex, the one I thought I'd never hear from again. We hadn't ended well, not because we didn't care, but because the world around us didn't. We were just kids in high school, figuring things out under the radar, in whispered texts and hidden glances. When my parents found out, I denied it so fast it broke us both. Adrian moved to another town. I stayed and buried myself in silence. Now, years later, his name lit up my screen like a flare. The message was short, casual. He said he was back in town and asked if I wanted to grab coffee. Just coffee, nothing more. I stared at the words for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I wasn't sure if I wanted to open that door again. But curiosity is a strange thing. It sits with you until you give in. So I replied yes. When we met, he looked older, but somehow the same. The kind of same that makes you feel like no time has passed, even when everything has changed. He smiled, I smiled back. We didn't talk about the past at first. We talked about work, weather, traffic, small things that people talk about when they're avoiding the big things. Then, after a long pause, he asked how my family had taken it. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was too heavy to cry over again. I told him the truth. That they'd shut the door and never opened it again. That I'd stopped trying to knock. He listened, the way he used to, without interruption. Then, almost like he'd been waiting for the right moment, he said he had an idea. He was organizing a small reunion, something for old classmates, friends, a casual thing. But he'd invited my family. Just casually. As if it was no big deal. And they'd said yes. My heart sank. I asked him why he'd do that, and he said maybe they just needed a different reason to show up. Maybe if it wasn't about me, they'd forget the wall they built. He said he didn't want to promise anything, but sometimes people surprise you. I didn't believe him, not really. But something in his eyes made me pause. Hope was dangerous, but it was still alive, flickering. I agreed to go. Not because I believed in a miracle, but because I wanted to see for myself. Maybe to prove nothing had changed. Maybe to see Adrian again. Maybe to show up for the boy I used to be, the one who cried into a pillow the night his whole world went dark. The reunion was planned at a local park, the same one where we used to have school fairs. As the date approached, I couldn't sleep. I imagined all the versions of that day, some where they hugged me, others where they looked through me like I didn't exist. Every scenario ended with me walking away alone. On the morning of the reunion, I stood in front of my mirror for a long time, holding a sweater I hadn't worn since the day I left home. It still smelled like the hallway closet, like cedar and forgotten things. I wore it anyway, not to impress, not to pretend, but to remind myself I was still me, changed, scarred, but whole. I walked to the park with my hands tucked in my pockets and my heart tucked behind every beat. Adrian was already there, arranging chairs, smiling at people. When he saw me, he gave a small nod, like he knew this wasn't easy. I nodded back. And then, I saw them. My parents. My sister. Standing together, talking to someone from the church. My breath caught. They looked the same. My mom's hair was shorter. My dad had more gray. Lacy wore a long cardigan like always. They hadn't seen me yet. I stood still, hidden behind a small tree near the edge of the path, my feet glued to the ground. I wasn't ready. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But this was the beginning. Even if it didn't feel like one. I stood there longer than I should have, watching them laugh at something a stranger had said, like they hadn't erased me, like they hadn't changed the locks and the memories at the same time. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the hem of my sweater, reminding me the world was still moving. Adrian noticed me hesitating. He didn't call out. Instead, he slowly made his way toward me, hands in his pockets, expression soft. He didn't ask what I was waiting for. He just stood beside me until I moved. Step by step, I walked closer, each footfall landing like a drumbeat in my chest. A few people turned and smiled. Old classmates waved. One or two blinked in surprise, maybe unsure if it was really me. And then my mother turned. Our eyes met for the first time in years. She froze, like she'd seen a ghost. My father looked up next, then Lacy. For a second, no one moved. The laughter died, the chatter dipped, and a cold hush fell over the patch of grass we shared. I thought maybe my legs would give out. My throat burned with all the words I had swallowed for so long. But I didn't speak. I just nodded once, polite and careful, like I was walking into a room where I didn't know if I belonged. My mother's mouth opened slightly, then shut. My father narrowed his eyes, as if trying to read what my presence meant. Lacy looked away. It was enough. I didn't need more. I turned and headed for the food table, where Adrian had laid out paper cups and soda and some snacks. He joined me a few seconds later, silently sliding a cup toward me. I took it with a nod, my hands shaking slightly. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. That moment with them, it hadn't gone horribly. But it hadn't healed anything either. It had just been, like a thread pulled taut but not yet snapped. The event trickled forward like a slow river. More people showed up, shared old stories, laughed at things that felt too far away to matter anymore. I mingled, half present, always aware of the space my family occupied, always wondering if they were watching. I caught Lacy glancing at me twice, once with a flicker of something like guilt, the second time with nothing but distance. I didn't blame her. Some people were taught to love with rules. Mine just happened to come with conditions. An hour passed before anything shifted. Adrian clinked a spoon against a plastic cup to get everyone's attention. He said a few kind words about friendship, time, and how everyone had changed but the memories remained. Then, without warning, he gestured toward me and said, "And some of us are still finding our way back." The words were simple, but the way he said them, the way every eye turned toward me, made my breath catch. I gave a nervous smile, lifted my cup slightly, then looked away. My mom took a step forward then. Not much, just a shuffle. But I saw it. She didn't say anything. She didn't even smile. But her eyes didn't hold judgment this time. Just hesitation. My father didn't move. Lacy crossed her arms tighter. I knew that was all I was going to get. After the event ended, people began drifting away. Adrian and I stayed behind to clean up. I reached for the empty chip bowl when I heard a voice behind me. "You look older." It was my mom. I didn't turn around right away. When I did, I kept my expression steady. I told her I was older. Life does that. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting. Then she said something that didn't sound like an apology, but tried to be. It wasn't easy for us. I nodded. I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to scream that it hadn't been easy for me either. That I had needed them, and they hadn't just failed me. They pretended I didn't exist. But I didn't say it. There was no space left in me for a fight. I just stood there and let the silence do its work. After a moment, she reached into her bag and handed me a folded envelope. I stared at it, confused. She said it was from my father. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single piece of paper. A note. Short. His handwriting still crooked and strong. If you ever need help, call this number. I won't say more. I stared at it for a long time. Not quite forgiveness. Not quite welcome. But something. Maybe a crack in the wall. I slipped the note into my pocket without a word. That night, Adrian walked me home. The streets were quiet. A few leaves chased each other along the pavement. We didn't talk until we reached my block. Then he asked if I was okay. I told him I didn't know. That I felt like someone had opened a door but not stepped aside to let me in. He nodded. He understood that feeling. He said sometimes you don't need them to open the door. You just need to know you're not the one who closed it. I slept light that night, the note still folded under my pillow, a whisper of what might be, of what never was. In the morning, there was a text from Lacy. Just 3 words. We weren't ready. I stared at it, wondering what it meant. If it was an excuse, a crack, or a start. I didn't reply. Not yet. I needed to think. I needed space. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel final. It felt like a pause. Days passed. Adrian and I talked more. Not just about family or the past, but about books and music and little things. It felt easy, like breathing after holding my breath for too long. We met for coffee once, then twice. By the 3rd time, he asked if I wanted to go somewhere with him. Somewhere outside of town. I asked why. He just smiled and said, because not every story ends the way it starts. I agreed. Not because I believed in fairy tales, but because I was tired of living in endings. Maybe this was a middle, maybe even a beginning. And this time, I was choosing the direction. The drive out of town was quiet at first, the kind of silence that wraps around 2 people who are still figuring out what they mean to each other again. Adrian played some old music, songs we used to hum in the hallways back in school, songs that brought back dusty corners of my memory. I watched the trees blur past, green melting into yellow as fall began to tug at the edges of summer. The road curved gently, and the further we got from the familiar, the lighter I felt. No expectations here. No memories etched into sidewalks or judgment hiding behind curtains. Just space. And Adrian. He took me to a cabin near a lake, one of those small wooden places that smelled of pine and old stories. It wasn't fancy. The floor creaked, the windows were a little fogged, and the porch swing looked like it had carried generations of quiet thoughts. But it was peaceful. Safe. He said his cousin owned it and barely used it. We dropped our bags inside, and he tossed me a spare key. Just in case you want to come alone next time. I pocketed it without saying anything, my fingers brushing the cool metal, wondering how something so small could feel so comforting. That night, we sat by the lake with mugs of coffee and jackets zipped up tight. The moon hung low, the water still. Adrian told me stories, his move after high school, the silence he lived in when we lost touch, the moment he saw my name online again and knew he had to reach out. I told him things too. About the night I slept on a bus bench, the first time I realized I didn't have to explain myself to strangers, the day I stopped missing the version of my parents that only existed in my hopes. We didn't cry. We didn't hold hands. We just sat there, 2 people who had made it through different kinds of storms. The next morning, I woke up early and sat on the porch, watching fog roll off the lake like a soft blanket being pulled away. My phone buzzed. I expected a news alert or a bank message, but it was from Lacy. A photo of our old backyard, the swing set we used to fight over, and beneath it, a caption, "Some things haven't changed." I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. Later that day, we drove back. The town looked the same, quiet, polite, slow. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies. Not for invitations. I wasn't that boy on the porch anymore. I was someone who had walked away and survived. That evening, Adrian invited me over for dinner. His apartment was small, warm, full of books and half-dead plants. We cooked together, laughing when the pasta stuck to the pan, and then sat at his tiny table with plates balanced on mismatched placemats. After we ate, he looked at me differently. Not with expectation, but with hope. He asked if I had ever thought about leaving town completely. Starting fresh. I had. More times than I could count. But fear always kept me here, fear that if I left, I'd never come back. That if they did change their minds, I wouldn't be there to see it. Adrian said he understood, but reminded me of something important. Forgiveness doesn't need witnesses. Healing doesn't wait for permission. I nodded, thinking of all the ways I'd waited, for birthdays that never came, calls that never rang, doors that never opened. A week passed. Then another. Lacy messaged more often. Short, strange things. A photo of my room, untouched. A screenshot of a recipe we both loved. A picture of our dog, old now, gray around the muzzle. My mom messaged once too. A single line. Dad asks about you. I didn't know if it was true or a game, but it didn't sting the way it used to. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Adrian and I were walking home from a movie when a car pulled up beside us. My dad's truck. The one with the dent on the back bumper. He rolled down the window and stared at us for a long second. His eyes didn't hold anger. They didn't hold warmth either. Just something heavy. He asked if we could talk. I wanted to run. Adrian's hand brushed mine, not to hold it, but to steady me. We got into the truck. I sat in the passenger seat, Adrian in the back. My dad drove a few blocks, then parked near the church lot where I used to help set up chairs for Sunday service. He turned off the engine and looked straight ahead. Then he said something I didn't expect. That he'd read my college application essays once, the ones I never knew he kept. That he'd been proud of me when I got the job at the bookstore, even if he never said it. That he was angry when I came out not because I was gay, but because he didn't understand how I had hidden it for so long. I stared at him, unsure if that was an excuse or regret. He said he wasn't asking to be forgiven, just to be seen. And then he looked at Adrian in the rearview mirror and said, "You stayed." I didn't. It wasn't a compliment. It was an admission, one that sat thick in the air between us. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. Then he handed me a small package. Inside was my old family photo, the four of us, on a beach, sunburned and laughing. Someone had written on the back, "Come home for one dinner." No questions. No expectations. He drove us back in silence. As we got out, he looked at me and said, "You don't have to come. But the door's not locked anymore." Then he drove off. I stood on the sidewalk, the package in my hand, the past in my chest, and the future unfolding in a way I never expected. Adrian didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew this was a choice I had to make alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept looking at the photo, tracing my younger face, wondering if that boy would have ever believed this day would come. I didn't know if I wanted to go back. I didn't know if I could forgive them. But the lock was gone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to take one step forward. The days that followed blurred quietly, like the way dust floats in a sunbeam, present, but light enough to ignore if you tried. I carried the photo with me everywhere, folded neatly into the side pocket of my jacket. I didn't look at it often, just enough to remind myself it was real, that this wasn't a dream I'd wake from to find the locks changed again. Adrian didn't push me to decide. He never asked if I was going to the dinner. He just made sure I had someone to talk to when the weight of silence got too heavy. Sometimes that was all I needed, not answers, not advice, just someone who wouldn't flinch at the mess of it all. Then, for days after the night in my dad's truck, I stood outside my old house. It felt smaller than I remembered. The porch paint was peeling. The curtains were different. A single porch light buzzed above the door, flickering faintly in the dusk. I stood there with a pie I'd picked up from the grocery store. Not because I wanted to bring a gift, but because I didn't want to show up empty-handed, like I had nothing left to offer. My hands were cold. My heart was louder than the quiet street around me. I knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. It was my mother. She didn't smile, but she stepped aside. I crossed the threshold carefully, like the floor might shift under my feet. Everything inside looked familiar. Same couch, same faint scent of lavender from the oil diffuser she always kept on the shelf. But it felt different, like a museum of a life I used to live. My dad appeared in the hallway, nodding once. Lacy peeked out from the kitchen, offered a small wave. I stood in the living room, holding the pie awkwardly, unsure if I should speak first. Dinner was quiet at first. Just clinks of forks and the low hum of conversation about nothing important. Weather, traffic, how the neighbor's fence finally collapsed. I answered when spoken to, kept my voice even. Inside, I felt like I was walking a tightrope. But then, something shifted. My dad cleared his throat and mentioned the first time I'd made dinner as a kid, how I burned the garlic bread and everyone pretended it was delicious. My mom smiled. It wasn't much, but it was real. Then Lacy brought up the summer we all got stuck at the airport overnight and played board games on the floor. Someone laughed. It might have been me. By the end of dinner, the room didn't feel so foreign. Still heavy, still tense in places, but lighter than I expected. After the plates were cleared, my mom sat down beside me on the couch. She didn't touch me, but she said, in a voice so quiet it barely reached me, that she'd been wrong, that they had all been wrong, that fear had made them small, but losing me had made them smaller. I looked at her, this woman who once rocked me to sleep, who once closed her eyes when I tried to speak the truth, and I saw how tired she looked. Not old. Just tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. I nodded. I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't, but I nodded, because I heard her. As I left that night, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photo of me at 5, dressed as a pirate for Halloween, grinning with a plastic sword. On the back, she had written, "We still have the costume. We never threw anything out." It made me smile, even if it also made my chest ache. The next week passed in odd waves. Some days I felt hope bubbling at the edges. Other days I felt like it was all too fragile to trust. Adrian noticed the swings in my mood. He never judged. He just kept showing up, with warm tea, with playlists he thought I'd like, with quiet patience. Then one evening, he said something I hadn't considered. That maybe the reunion wasn't just about family. Maybe it was about me seeing how much I'd changed, how far I'd come. Maybe, just maybe, the apology I was waiting for wasn't from them, but from myself, forever thinking I was less because of their silence. I thought about that all night. The next morning, I texted my dad. "Let's talk. Just us." He replied almost immediately. "Sunday. The park. 4 p.m. When Sunday came, I wore the same sweater I'd worn to the reunion. Maybe because I wanted the story to loop. Maybe because I wanted to remind myself of that first moment of courage. We met near the lake. He was already sitting on the bench, looking out over the water. I joined him without a word. For a while, we said nothing. Then he spoke. He told me he had spent a year after I left trying to convince himself I'd come back, that things would go back to normal. But then he realized there was no normal to return to, that the version of me he'd tried to raise had never truly existed, because I had spent so much time hiding, shaping myself into a son he could accept, instead of being the son I actually was. He said he hated himself for missing out, that he didn't want to miss out anymore. Then he said something I never expected, that he and Mom had started going to a local support group for parents of LGBTQ kids, that it was hard at first, that they sat in the back for weeks before speaking, but that listening to other parents' stories helped them hear their own shame out loud. And it started to sound ugly, and familiar, and wrong. I didn't cry. Not then. I just nodded slowly, watching the ducks glide across the surface of the lake, wondering how many more surprises the world could offer me. Then he asked me a question. Simple, direct. "Would you bring Adrian next time?" That's when I knew something had really changed. The next weekend, Adrian and I went back together. This time, I didn't stand outside the door. I walked right in. My mother greeted us. She smiled. A real one. Lacy offered Adrian a soda, joked about how the Wi-Fi still acted up. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. That night, as we left, Adrian squeezed my hand. Not to comfort me, not to steady me, just because he could. And I didn't flinch. I didn't hide. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was stepping into a version of home that had space for all of me. Not a pretend version. A new one. One built on cracks, patched together with effort, with learning, with grace. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of something that might just last. Months passed, not in a blur, but in careful, meaningful steps. I didn't rush anything. Neither did they. Healing wasn't something you could schedule or speed up. It happened in small moments, a text from my dad asking if I'd seen a new movie, a phone call from my mom asking for Adrian's favorite dessert recipe, a group selfie from Lacy at the county fair with a quiet, "Wish you were here," tucked in the corner. They weren't grand gestures, but they felt like peace offerings, laid gently on the table for me to accept or ignore. Adrian and I began spending weekends at the cabin again. Not to escape, but to breathe. It had become our place, where the air felt cleaner, where conversations flowed easier. One evening, while folding an old quilt near the fire, Adrian asked if I had ever considered moving back to town properly. Not just hovering on the edge of it, but really planting roots again. I told him I didn't know. That part of me was still scared that it would all collapse again. That one wrong sentence or one tired glare would remind me that forgiveness can sometimes feel like a loan waiting to be revoked. But he reminded me that it wasn't just about them anymore. It was about me. About choosing my place, not waiting for someone else to give it to me. Then, as winter began brushing its cold fingers across the town, something unexpected happened. My dad called and asked if we'd join them for Thanksgiving dinner. It would be the first one I'd attended in years. The first one where I wouldn't be hiding. I hesitated, but Adrian said gently, "You don't have to prove anything. But maybe they're trying to show you they're ready now." We went. The house was warm when we arrived. The smell of rosemary and baked apples wrapped around us like a memory. My mom opened the door before we knocked. She hugged me. Just hugged me. No words. My father followed, shaking Adrian's hand firmly, even clapping his shoulder once like they were old friends. Lacy greeted us with a grin and a sarcastic, "Didn't think you'd show." Dinner was simple. Turkey, potatoes, awkward pauses filled with gravy and soft laughter. There was a moment, right before dessert, when my dad stood up and tapped his glass with a fork. He cleared his throat. Then, slowly, he said, "I want to say something. I know this won't fix everything, but I need to say it anyway." The room stilled. I was wrong. We were wrong. About Jonah. About love. About what it means to be a family. He looked at me then. His voice wavered, but he held steady. "I spent too many years trying to be the kind of father I thought I was supposed to be. Turns out, I was just scared. But fear isn't an excuse for silence. Or cruelty." He sat down quietly. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Not tight. Not desperate. Just present. That night, as Adrian and I walked home through streets glittering with early holiday lights, I couldn't help but feel that something big had quietly ended, and something even bigger had begun. But peace has a way of attracting storms, and mine arrived in a single envelope on a frosty January morning. A letter from a distant uncle I hadn't heard from in years. A lawyer. The contents were simple but sharp. My grandfather had passed, and he'd left me something. A farmhouse. The one he and I used to visit every summer. The one with the big red barn, the tires swing, and the cracked porch steps I'd always tripped on. It was unexpected. My parents didn't even know yet. I visited the place alone. Snow blanketed the yard, quiet and thick. The house creaked like it remembered me. Every room whispered memories, games of hide and seek, fresh pies cooling on windowsills. The summer I told my grandfather I was gay, and he just nodded and passed me another scoop of ice cream without a word. He never made a speech, but he never made me feel small either. Now, it was mine, but with it came more than dust and old furniture. The town council had been planning to buy the land. Developers wanted to tear it down and build vacation rentals. My family had assumed they'd get it. They weren't pleased when they found out it was mine. My dad called, not with anger, but confusion. My mom asked if I would do the right thing and sell it to the family. I didn't answer, because I didn't know what the right thing was anymore. The place was full of ghosts, but it was also full of beginnings. That night, I sat on the porch swing, snow falling lightly around me, and I realized something. This wasn't just a house. It was a choice, a symbol, of whether I was still living in their story or writing my own. The next day, I called Adrian. I told him I wanted to fix the porch, paint the walls, maybe turn the place into something new. A space for others like me. Like us. A quiet place to land when the world felt too loud. He didn't hesitate. "I'm in," he said. We told my family a week later. My mom cried. My dad nodded, said he understood. But Lacy smiled, said it sounded like something only I could pull off. In the months that followed, we worked every weekend. Scrubbing, painting, planting. Friends came to help. Neighbors dropped off tools and casseroles. Strangers emailed to ask if they could donate. Somehow, it became more than a project. It became a place of peace. And in the center of it all stood the version of me I had fought so long to become. Not perfect, not finished, but real, and whole, and finally home. Because some stories don't end with forgiveness. They begin with truth, and grow from there.